Everybody. So welcome to this set of lectures. So today I'm the one talking about basically qualitative research, and in particular interview strategies and other types of qualitative research. I want to make this interactive whenever possible. You can definitely type things out during the talk, or you can just even raise your hand and ask questions. I'll try to keep this within the 1 hour, and then you guys can also ask questions of us. And then I noticed that some of the other professors are here, so you can feel free to talk to us basically as well. Okay, so today we're talking about what we're calling mixed methods research. So today's outline is basically I'll talk a little bit about the idea of what we're doing, and then some different methods of study, qualitative methods, in particular interview. I think that's the most important one. And then qualitative coding of that data, and then some other methods. We probably don't have time to do the prototyping part, but I think Dr. Gong is talking about that later. So I think it's okay. And I'm also not talking about experimental design so much, although I touch on it a little bit, because I think Dr. Fan and Dr. Liu will talk about that later as well. So I think the important thing right now that I think a lot of us have to get sort of renew their kind of thinking about is the idea that in the traditional kind of scientific endeavor, and even traditional HCI, what we've been doing is basically this idea of like running an experimental group and running a control group. So yeah, so you guys all know what that means, I think. So the traditional approach basically uses this hypothesis-driven approach. Like, so you have some theory, you make some hypothesis about that theory, and then you basically compare these two groups. And before you do it, you want to do a power analysis to figure out whether that's enough for this experiment. And then afterwards, you can basically either reject that hypothesis, or what they call is, they don't say accept the hypothesis, they just say you don't reject that hypothesis. Because you never really prove anything, you just get really good evidence for something. But what we're doing actually today is a little bit different. What we're doing today is actually this qualitative paradigm. And I would say this is kind of a more informative way of looking at things. And to be honest, a lot of us are using this paradigm. I mean, I think folks in my projects in particular are going to be using this paradigm a lot. Some of you might still use the traditional paradigm, but I think the qualitative paradigm is definitely super helpful and useful. So that's what I'm talking about today. And most of the projects I'm doing actually are using this qualitative. So the qualitative is kind of the opposite of this deductive approach, is kind of more inductive reasoning. So what that means is basically you form a research question, and then you gather lots of information. I think of it as like excavation. So in other words, getting like archaeological data, right? Like that's kind of like the metaphor for this. You go and you dig up some interesting evidence for this question. And then what you do here, instead of doing power analysis, is you just keep digging until you don't get any new findings. Right, so that's kind of what archaeologists do. They just keep digging until they can't find any more, beautiful vases, right, vases. And then what they do afterwards is they take all these findings and they basically categorize them into the different insights and different categories, basically. And so the term for this is called grounded theory. So grounded theory means you get the theory from the data, not the opposite around. Okay, so you have a research question, and then you gather lots of data, and you try to form a theory based on what you find. Okay, so this type of inquiry has its disadvantages as well. So, for example, there's some context dependence of this. If you did all your research with Chinese participants, then the question that reviewers may have is like, is this repeatable, and is this like generalizable, basically? You can also get lots of data a lot of times, and it can't be subject to a level of bias and interpretation. If you have that, of course, you need to state that clearly in the paper. So, for example, if you're working with a particular population, but your paper is claiming about something bigger than that, then you want to say that in the limitations of the paper, basically. You may also want to say things like, is it generalizable to different contexts? The picture I show here basically is from Knossos in Greece. I actually took these pictures myself. And you can see actually what happened here was that the experimenter in this case is Arthur Evans, basically. It's like a famous archaeologist. He basically took a bunch of, how do you say, like fragments of stuff, basically. So fragments of stuff he found in the archaeological sites, basically. And then, but those fragments are incomplete. So as you can see, basically, you see how this fragment only has like the body and kind of like part of a leg here, right? So what that means is everything behind these two fragments are actually created by the archaeologist. Okay, so everything behind is actually like postulated by Arthur Evans's archaeologists. So how did they come up with this like blue head? Because one archaeologist actually came up with the blue head, and then the other archaeologist came up with a blue monkey, right? So, so they did this because. So I think one of you is kind of talking, so maybe you can mute unless you're asking a question. Okay, thank you. So actually, you might be able to guess which one of these are actually the real thing in the archaeology museum, right? Basically, one of these is actually generated by machine learning. You guys, we can talk about this later. But basically, what you can see is actually there's multiple interpretation of this evidence, right? So this evidence of this piece of archaeological find can have multiple interpretations. So you're going to run into that as well, basically. So your evidence can be interpreted in different ways. That's just the nature of qualitative research. But what that means is you have to make good arguments. That means you have to write well. And then also it means that in the limitations and kind of discussion of your paper, you have to fully disclose the biases and subjectiveness of your approach. Okay, so that's kind of a fundamental issue with qualitative research. That's what makes it different from this traditional paradigm. But as you will see, like this paradigm allows you to have much richer types of results, richer types of understanding. It's almost like an artistic, almost like approach, where you're trying to see people's reaction to things. It's almost like that. It's much richer. Okay. It's like a field study. Okay, so yeah, any questions about this so far? Or maybe my voice, if it's okay. It's good so far? Okay. So the stuff that you're going to probably you see a lot are interviews and content analysis. So interviews are one way of just talking to people about their community. It's self-report. But sometimes to avoid kind of just complete self-report, you can also do content analysis, which means actually looking at things that you submit to them, to basically prompts that you give them. So maybe you ask them to sketch something or make something, and they created some artifact. You can look at the content of that artifact, or you can look at the conversations that they have when they're talking to ChatGPT. So that would also be content analysis, or the stories that they write. So these are all content. So these are probably the two kind of main methods of this data collection. So you can also choose your own method. If you want to do quantitative studies, that's totally fine. You can use a survey, etc. That is totally legit as well. You can mix these two. So that's why our approach is called mixed methods. Is you can have a quantitative component where you're studying people's reaction time or their survey ratings, and you can have a qualitative part, and then you can kind of mix and match and basically discuss both of them in the context of your study. Okay. Now, for the qualitative part, actually, the credibility does matter because you're the one doing the interpretation. So how do you have good credibility is in your paper, you need to state, and in your project, you need to figure out good previous sources that you're using to base your methods on, right? So the methods of analysis, the scales that you use, et cetera, those all matter to establish your credibility so that your biases are clear, And to be clear, it's okay to have biases and limitations. You just have to clearly know what you yourself don't know, basically. So in the paper, you just have to clearly disclose those problems of bias. Okay. Okay, so just to kind of tell stories behind this. So Jean Piaget is a well-known developmental psychologist, and I think I want to use him to make a point to be the astute observer. So basically, he came up with these kind of stages of development, mental development in young children by observing his own children. So that's kind of one thing that you can do is actually you can just observe. So for example, if you go on VR chat and observe what people do, for example, that would be an example of just being just a complete observer and not, take part in the intervention at all. Now you can also be part of the observational process. So this is Margaret Mead. So she went to like Polynesia to study like kind of family and sexual habits of the local people there. And basically, she just embedded herself in the community in order to study them in more detail. Now, as you can see, she's white, so she doesn't exactly like fit into this community, right? So there's still a level of bias to it. But for those of you who say want to go into VR chat to study, well, one way is to actually become part of that community and then kind of learn from that community. That's also something you can do. So those are kind of more observational things. So there's also interviews. So interviews, you just directly, if you don't know answers to your questions, you just talk to people in that community directly. And then the content analysis is, like I said, it's basically taking a look at what they created and then analyzing that. There's also this idea of like the focus group. So focus group is basically instead of doing individual one-on-one or two-on-one interviews, you create a group where you discuss something together. So this is used in the industry a lot, and potentially it can also be used here in your projects, especially if you're evaluating some system, I would say. Basically, they all have a stake in trying to get your system to be really helpful for the users. So that's why the focus groups are what they are. And they kind of tend to be a little bit more collaborative. So if somebody misses something, other people can kind of, work together, kind of thing. But then there's also like issues. So for example, someone can potentially dominate the conversation. If that happens, the experimenter actually has to kind of like make sure that everybody has a equal way of expressing themselves in these focus groups. So typically, I would say that the interview gets used a little bit more than the focus group if you want it to be a little bit more objective. There's also diary studies, and actually the study that Dr. Tone did that I was part of for the VR museum was kind of like this autobiographical study. So you can also do that. That's a more subjective way of doing the study, but you can definitely justify in HCI now. So HCI is very open to that. And of course, you can also take a look at other things such as online forums where you're just digging, data mining, to get the data that you're interested in and then analyze the content, for example. Okay, so any questions about kind of the various types of methods that are available? Everybody's still good, doing good? Okay. So again, if you have any questions, like feel free to shout it out, etc. I'm totally okay. Or you can, if you post in the chat right now, I can also, view very quickly. Okay, so so let's talk first about interviews. So that's probably the most predominantly used one. So first of all, there's some assumptions that we also have to be clear about. So what people say is not necessarily what they do, okay? So we run into this issue a lot when we study climate change. Everybody says that they're pro-climate. Basically they're all, Democrats, right? Like you can't, that's impossible, basically. But they will all tell you that because in their private life, what they do can be completely different. So that's one assumption. The other assumption is that even if they do what they say, right, they may not know what they actually do. So in other words, they fill in the details of the stuff that they don't know. So my kind of example for this is basically there's a well-known thing that you can Google. Basically, Alan Alda was interviewing Elizabeth Loftus, who is a well-known neuropsychologist. And then her famous work is to basically, she works with juries and looking at how they evaluate car accidents to see who's at fault on a car accident, for example. So in this story, what happens is in the first day of the interview, Alan, kind of mentioned something about eggs, and then somehow, Elizabeth Loftus implanted the idea that eggs are kind of if you eat them, they're kind of sick, and somehow Alan Alda, so she's really good at this. It's like Inception, right? So somehow Alan Alda got the idea that when he was little, he didn't eat eggs basically because when he ate them, he got sick. Okay, so it's like Inception. So the next day, the funny story is that next day the interview continues, and then somebody brings in the breakfast, right? And then somebody bring in scrambled eggs, and Alan's, oh no, I don't eat eggs. I got sick, I got sick eating eggs. So basically, it's completely someone else's idea. And so that's an example of people filling in details, right? So they don't have good memories. They fill in, they fill in their memory. And in fact, the traffic accidents is a really good example when people interview the witnesses, and what they actually remember, versus what happened. Basically, if you give them a sketch that's slightly different, they will say things completely differently. They'll say the car hit the tree versus the car crashed into the tree, for example. So yeah, people are quite unreliable. So you have to kind of filter out the unreliability part. The third part is also important, is that when you're talking to people during their interview, and this is very important because if you don't do it correctly, you're not going to get good results. I mean, we guarantee you, we've done this many times, so we know. But one of the faults is basically you think that they're designing this thing with you, but they don't, okay? So when you ask them questions, you have to just ask them how they feel. If they're having a trouble with something, you just ask directly about that thing. They don't actually design your system. They don't know anything about what you should do with this thing or whether that button belongs this or that, they just tell you their feeling about the situation, okay? So don't, you cannot use your perspective to ask them questions. You have to ask their perspective, which can be completely naive, which means they don't know anything, right? Okay, so those are really important. Let me also talk about note taking. So usually when you're doing this interview, you're probably going to have one person who's asking the question, and then you have another person. I mean, I assume some of you will be doing it online, some of you will be doing it offline. But in either case, you probably have another person who's doing note taking. If you're really experienced, some people can do both of those things at the same time. But I would say for the beginner students, you would separately do this. For the note taker, then they need to write down what they see. So obviously, right? So try to write down everything that you hear, everything. It's typically very fast. So typically when I do this, I don't stop. I just keep writing, because I hear something, I write it down. I see something, I write it down, etc. There's also the opportunity, if you're a good interviewer, a note taker, to actually start writing the inferences. So for example, the description can be, she pressed the, the submit button 3 times, let's say. But the inference for that would be she was frustrated with the submit button, or she couldn't understand the submit button, or something like that. So that would be an inference based on your description. Typically, I would say you don't need to make the evaluative note-taking unless, you're just very skilled. But the evaluative part is basically to quickly go from the description and the inference into something about this behavior. To say like what your paper wants to say about it almost, right? Like, so you want to, kind of give the general story right away. So sometimes you could do that. Sometimes I do that too, because if I hear something really super interesting, I'll just like, I want to write that evaluation down. And just make sure I know it's evaluation. It's not what they said, okay? What they said is description, okay? One other thing with the description is you have to make sure that the description includes both their verbal behavior and their nonverbal behavior. Okay, it's not just what they said or what they wrote down. You need to look their eyes, like are they wandering in different places? Are they confident when they say it? A lot of the communication actually comes through non-verbally. I would say probably 80–90% of the information comes from non-verbal communication. And if you see that they're confused, that could be a non-verbal thing. Okay. Any questions about note-taking? Okay, so the interview steps, and this is going to be different for each group, different for each person. But in general, these are some of the steps that you can take. You want to tell the purpose, you want to state what the purpose is, because if you're transparent, they're going to be more transparent with you. So you want to just say like, oh, well, I'm conducting an experiment, we are conducting an experiment with, research project about blank, blank, blank. And then you also want to tell them that, you're going to use their data, but it's going to be anonymous. It won't never be published. All the analysis steps, the participants will be kept as a number, but not as their actual name, et cetera, et cetera. You want to also ask to record something. So typically, I would say recording voice is probably enough. What that means is though that the note taker should also, they need to take a picture or they need to write down some non-verbal thing. The note taker needs to do that. Otherwise, you just record the video. So that's also possible. You get a lot more data, but you have to sort through that data. So you want to ask them when you're doing either of those things. You also want to make sure everybody's comfortable, of course. You want to look at the person. You don't want to look at your notes. So that's why if you are working solo, then you have to be really good at note-taking because you have to look them in the eye and type like this, right? So if you are working, 2 people, then there's no excuse for you not to look at the person, right? You just look at your question and you look at the person. In fact, try not to read from your notes, at all much. The next thing is you don't want to ask leading questions. So an example of that is, for example, if you just ask directly, do you play Warcraft twice a week? Why is that? Because that first assumes that they play video games. And then it also assumes that they play a particular video game. So you want to first ask something that doesn't lead them to want to answer a particular way. So you can just ask like, you play video games, oh, do you play Warcraft? And then you kind of keep going from there. Okay. You also want to keep your own scripts short. So one of the big things about the interview part is you want to make sure that you're not the one doing the talking. You want to make sure they are the one doing the talking, because that's how you're going to learn. Your scripts or your questions are really meant to promote them to be able to talk about themselves, right? First about their own experience, etc., their own workflow, and then to talk about what they're going through when they're going through your system. And you want to keep on time. You don't want to go over, and you want to also leave a little bit of time for them to ask questions if they need to. So here's some other keys about interviews. So you want to be very structured because you don't want to just like start doing random stuff. You want to say like, okay, the first 20 minutes we're gonna ask you about your experience, blah blah blah, and then we're gonna let you play a prototype and blah 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 blah, right? So just make sure you have a reasonable structure. Another thing that's really important that I also already started to talk about is you make sure you let people finish talking. It doesn't matter what it is. It might not even be related to the topic, okay? Whatever it is, you just let them finish. When they finish and it wasn't the right topic, then you can ask them something different. It's totally okay because there's kind of two things that come with this. One is you might be missing something. They could say something in the middle of trying to finish that will actually be relevant, to you. The other thing is that it gives them empowerment. Like if you're interrupting them all the time, then they're not empowered to talk. So the next time they have some really confusing thing or they wanted to share some very personal thing, they might not want to do it anymore because you just interrupted them last time. Okay, so I would say if they're talking, you let them finish talking, regardless of what happens. Okay, so that's very important. I would say probably that's number one skill. Now there are some more advanced skills here, and like I said, these really are skills. Like right now, all of you or some of you probably thinking, oh yeah, I can interview people, no problem. I talk to people about my game before, or whatever. Well, when you're really doing it for this program and you have a project where you really need kind of this really deeper level insights, you're going to find these skills are super duper important, not only for interview, but like for life, basically. When you're doing other types of investigations, it's very important. It's like a journalist. So the next skill is to be empathetic. So you want to think from their perspective. If they're going through something and they're talking aloud, I'll tell you guys a little bit more about talking aloud later. But if they're talking about their experience as they're talking to you, you don't want to like criticize them or say, oh, well, we were just trying to make this. You don't get that. Don't say that, right? You always want to be empathetic to them. If they didn't understand something, you just take their perspective and say, oh, okay, so let's see, what is it that about this thing that's confusing? I mean, oftentimes that's enough. You don't need to say too much. Another one that's a little bit clear, obvious, but sometimes people don't do it, is to not use technical jargon. Don't use ChatGPT even. Don't use, I wouldn't even use anything like, VR even, like AR, like use just simple language, give them a situation and ask them to do something. No need to add any technical information. Always ask for clarification, but don't try to interpret like them. Basically, it's a very fine line, right? So sometimes you're asking them, do they mean this? And then sometimes you're asking them just like, what do they mean? So I would say ask what do they mean more than like, do you mean this? It's an art, so you just don't want to impose your own understanding to the situation. You want to allow them to clarify what they mean. Another really kind of obvious one, I would say, is don't judge, but sometimes people do this. So don't judge them, don't say like, oh, wow, that, that sucks, like, oh, really? Like, oh, you really wear that, like, don't say that, obviously, right? Don't judge them. Just like accept whatever they're saying, accept everything. Don't ask like specifically for kind of like, things that they don't know about, basically. Like, they heard that their aunt does this, like, don't ask for that kind of stuff. Try to ask questions that probe what they want. Sometimes a lot with the Chinese population, we tend to have participants that maybe stop talking. So in that case, you want to probe them with a further question. And then when you keep probing them, you can follow them with a direct question about something specifically they said. Okay. So I'll get to that at the last part of this slide. Another kind of a more advanced skill is to ask more to ask more how questions than why questions. Again, this is a fine line. Some of you will do it differently, but for me personally, if you ask them why questions, they tend to kind of, give you explanations that may not be related to the skill at hand. They might go into these kind of directions that have to do with philosophy or, stuff like that. So sometimes it isn't as good as a how question, because the how question, they can very specifically answer you. They don't really need to think to answer how questions, because they just tell you, right? But why questions, they have to think. So it's just more complicated. I would also say, even though I said before that we don't want to ask for gossip, but you don't want to be afraid of quote unquote embarrassing topics, because a lot of times what causes embarrassment or things like that is something wrong with the technology or some particular interaction that they may have with the technology. So don't be afraid to dig into that, right? So even if it's embarrassing, it's okay. If they don't want to answer, you can also say, well, if you don't have to answer, if you don't want to, but I'm curious about when you mentioned that thing about, relationship management, blah, blah, blah. So it's totally okay to go there as long as it's, you had consent and everything. And then the last thing I said was, don't say something very, very specific until they mention it, usually, okay? So in other words, for example, even if you evaluate your prototype, for example, and they didn't mention about some particular thing, try to make it so that you only ask about it if they actually engage you on it. So you can probe them, but you don't want to mention something specific until they say it, because it could be misleading if you say it first, basically. Do you know what I mean? So it's a little bit tricky, but again, with all these skills though, like you just have to practice, right? So I would say for the people who are getting to the stage where they're almost ready to do the study, I think some of the studies are getting ready to that point. For the next couple of weeks, you're going to have an opportunity to start using these skills, and you can use them on family, friends, loved ones first, so that you can get really good at them. And then you're going to use them on strangers, and that's going to be a lot harder, but that's going to be very useful for you, not only for your HCI research, but also your own career, as a scientist and as a writer and, experimenter and, everything really, teacher. Okay, so any questions about the interviews, skills, strategies, etc.? Yeah, I know some of you are shy, so we can, at the end, we have a kind of a question answer type thing, and feel free at that point also to just share your comments about what works and what doesn't, etc. Okay. So just a quick example. So this is a study that we did with drones. So in this case, what happens is we let the dancers dance with drones. It's called Dances with Drones. And then we had them dance with one drone, and then we had them dance with two drones, and then we had them dance with a partner. So, obviously you're not going to be able to read this whole thing right now, but as you can see, the experimenter, first of all, has a pretty reasonably short script. For the most part, the participants said more than the experimenter. So that's always good. And then you notice also that there's a lot of questions about how you feel. Like, for example, what happened when you got hit? Like, what do you feel about that? How do you feel? Were they like, okay, it's all over, So a lot of questions about feelings and things like that, because it's kind of easier for them to answer those kind of things. Anybody can answer those types of questions. And then also they ask things that are pretty specific once it gets mentioned. So for example, what was the major difference between one and two drone? And then the participant goes on and on. You can also see here that sometimes the experimenter doesn't say much. So that's the participant doesn't say much. So the experimenter has to kind of like, keep probing, right? So, some of it is a little bit interpretive here. This is walking a thin line right here about the desynchronization thing. But, it's up to you as an experimenter to kind of balance, how much interpretation you're giving as opposed to how much they're talking about that, right? But as you can see, in this question about at the beginning, you pick one drone. Well, you let them talk, right? You always just let them finish talking. I think that's that's the main thing. Okay, so this is kind of a transcript of the kind of experiments that interview that you would have with people. Okay. So once you have the experimental data from the interviews, then you want to do a coding analysis. We actually don't have time here to go into like super detailed about how that's done. But basically what you do is you take, most of the time it's done with multiple people. So usually you have like, let's say 2 people both code the same data. So what they have to first come up with is like a code book. So once you get a code book ready, so that means like, okay, this part of the data means this, that part of the data means something else. And then once you do that, then you independently code the transcript, basically. Okay, so I think probably this is more useful. So for example, this is what they responded. And then the initial code is basically saying, the part about appreciate how the instructor encourages to voice our opinion, that's saying about the encourage, viewpoint expression, right? So different parts of the interview data is given different codes, you can see. So the initial coding is very like, like there's lots and lots of codes because, each part of that says something different. And then the focus group coding is basically try to group these sort of related codes into one code, basically. So that's what we mean by coding, is just to code what the interview data is telling you, basically. Okay. So this is another example. So this is something that they wrote, or maybe what they said. And then you can actually you can see that you can even use just like analog tools to code as well. There's also online apps and stuff that you can help as well. And then for some of you with the Chinese, you may have to code in Chinese, or you can code in English the original data in Chinese. So whichever way you come up with, of course, at the end of the research publication would still be in English. Okay, so this is the longer process of establishing the code, and then from the code into the category. So eventually, with the grounded theory, establish this like kind of body of theory about this process, basically. So that's when you can basically stop. Okay, so that's what the grounded theory means. Is you go from the lower level coding of the actual data, which there's a lot of, into like higher and higher levels, so that sort of theories can emerge from this coding process, basically. And that's what you will write about also in your results. Okay, so I think I have time probably just to give a very quick example. So this is which one should I do first? Let me do Dr. Tong's example really fast. I have permission from Dr. Tong to use this. So this is looking at older people working with technology. You guys can see this, right? Yeah, okay. So you can see that all the participants are numbered, right? So they're all anonymized. And then basically there's a code book. I didn't show you the code book here, but the code book basically says what are the possible codes here. And then when they set something, so you can see it here. So when they set this stuff, that gets coded into some code. And then sometimes what they said has multiple codes because it's talking about multiple things, so this is kind of like what your code book would look like, coded by one person, basically. Okay, so everything they're saying gets coded into some code. This is the initial code. Obviously, this will get coded into more and more complicated codes, Okay, so you get the idea. I'll also show you briefly, you can also do that for video data. So this is video data of dancer movements. I work a lot with dancers. So here, this is actually the code book. So the code book is basically the experimenters all agree these are the possible codes. So for example, reaction to music by body movement, reaction to music by facial expression, blah, 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 blah. And then individually, they go in and code the video. So you can see here, this is the video. And then basically, in this case, they just check mark what the code is as opposed to writing it down. You can do it any way you like. Okay, and then you can count up the number of these things in the video, and you can also present that as well. Okay, so this is just a different participant. Okay, and these are the codes generated. Okay. So in both cases, though, you have to agree that that's your basic code. Okay. Okay, we're running out of time a little bit, so I want to leave you guys time to ask questions. So one kind of last bit of thing I want to go over, a couple bits of things. One is this idea of the Hawthorne effect. So just remember that when you're making an observation, you're always causing some change in the person being observed. So when you're talking to them or you're observing them doing something, it actually changes what they do. So the really good example is basically the original Hawthorne effect, is where they went into the factory to study how fast people can make a particular product. And then so they go into the factory, they turn on the lights, and they take a look at how quickly people are doing this, right? Okay, so they want to compare whether the light level makes a difference or not. So if you turn on light versus low light, does that like increase people's productivity, right? What they saw is actually when they turn on the light, people's productivity increased. But guess what? It's because it's an observer effect. It's because they know that people are coming in to look at them, right? So the next time they did this, they didn't turn on the light and they just come in and increase the productivity. So that's an example of this Hawthorne effect, because by observing people, you are already changing what they're doing. So in other words, when you're observing them playing a game, for instance, you know, they can get better because you're there, or they can get worse because they're nervous. So these are all things that you need to be aware of, and potentially things that you need to write about in the paper. Okay, I'm going to skip this part because this next part is related to the Hawthorne effect. It's basically about people being able to make up stories, basically. So there's actually like more types of strategies that you can use. I kind of went over the most important ones already, so I think I'll just skip this setup. This is just saying, in this slide is basically, I'm just talking about in physical reality, offline, people actually usually do the observation on like one-way mirrors, so that it doesn't influence people, the people being observed. So basically, it's trying to overcome the Hawthorne effect. Okay, so I don't have a lot of time to talk about questionnaires, but they tend to be used a lot. So I just wanted to share like some basic, ideas for this, just because lots of students do this. I put this at kind of the end because, just remember that interviews are still kind of the most important, because you're getting the most kind of unfiltered source of data. Questionnaires, they have to think about what they want to say, and then they will say something that you want to hear as well. So just be careful. But for the questionnaire, what I want to share is that first of all, don't make up your own scale. Okay, it's not validated. It's not like tested with lots of people. You want to go into the literature and cite something that's used a lot. Okay, so these are the ones these are some of the ones out there. But of course, for your project, it'll be different for whatever thing that you're doing. And whatever content you're trying to measure. And then in the Google form or whatever thing you use to create your questionnaire, you want to make sure that things are anonymized. They have a fear of being anonymous. Sometimes you have to get consent in these forms. Make sure you get the demographic information, but demographic information cannot be too invasive. For example, I tend to give people age range and not the actual age, because you want to have a certain level of like anonymity kind of attached to that. You don't want to give a lot of headings information. Like, don't say like climate change attitude positivity survey. Just say survey, because if they see climate change, automatically they know what to say, kind of, right? They're expecting what to say. So you don't actually need to give a lot of headings information. It's more for like your own kind of data management. Typically, we like to use scales.odd number because you can calculate the median more easily. So typically, you want to use like a 7-point scale. I mean, I would say usually 7-point scales are pretty straightforward. Sometimes people use 5-point scales, etc. But odd number so that it's easier to calculate the median. That's something that's can be considered. And then you want to use kind of the linear scale or the multiple choice grid. So the multiple choice grids allows you people to, this is what is seen on the right here, allows you to kind of, and this is from Dr. Liu, basically, teaching us how to use multiple choice grid. But basically that allows you to answer a lot of different questions with the same format. But you can also use the linear scale, then it would be like one question at a time. Of course, you want to make sure that all the answers are required. You don't want people to skip on the questions. And then sometimes your sentences have to be very clear, right? So for example, even here, you can see, when people read this, they know how to answer this. I felt poorly accepted by the group of robots. Okay, like agree, disagree, whatever it is, I know what thing I need to evaluate. So if you give them something that's like, how good was the survey? Sometimes it's not, like what does good mean, right? So you have to be like kind of clear and specific enough so that they know what to answer about the survey. Okay. I'm going to skip this part, but if some of you who are doing quantitative work, so for example, measuring, reaction time or anything, or ability in the speech, etc., then you may have to do a power calculation beforehand. But anyways, you can talk to your supervisor independently if you have a situation like that. Then you need to figure out what's the sample size you need to use. So that's for the inductive approach. For the deductive approach. So for our qualitative type of work, you don't typically do that. You typically just keep interview until you don't find more insights. So this is the model that I talked about earlier. So for that, it's also kind of based on previously how many people typically do this. It could be a lot, it could be a little. I mean, really, there's no hard, fast rule about this on the qualitative side. So I don't have a slide on the qualitative side, but on the qualitative side, could be, you could be done when you have like 20 or 30, but you could also, do it with 10 if it's a case study, so it really depends. Just look at the Chi papers and see what are typical ranges. Okay, the last thing I will go over, we don't have time for the exercise, but just to tell you that this is also one thing you can do. As a part of the observation process, you can also ask people to talk aloud, like think aloud, basically. So just say what they're doing and what they're thinking. And actually, this worked quite well when we had the dancers as well, because they would tell us what they were thinking, etc. And it gives you insights about, what they're doing, basically. Okay. So, this would, you basically ask them to do a particular task. Okay. Now, there are some limitations. If you ask them to think aloud, they're going to have additional things they have to do, right? So it means they have a cognitive load, so they might go slower because of that, right? But if they get stuck or they just stop talking, you need to give them some prompts, such as like, oh, what are you expecting here? What does this mean? Just keep going, etc. Okay. So this is an example. So for example, if someone's playing an app, they can basically start describing this as like, oh, let's see, I clicked on this button because I wanted to see this picture of Derek Jeter. And then I went to this other interface because I wonder if there's another way to view this game, blah, 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 right? So as they're playing this, I know this is a little bit too fast, but as they're playing this, they would tell you like why they're going to a particular place or what are they doing and what are they thinking when they're at a particular place. That's an example of the think aloud. But having said that, think aloud can be used for anything, like any process. Like you can ask them to think aloud when they're visiting some room, or you can ask them to think aloud when they're making a decision in a game. Any of those things are potential for this type of investigation. Okay, so we're going to skip that. So we don't have time to talk about the prototyping today, but I think Dr. Gong will talk about this. But this is just a quick view about the different type of prototyping strategies in general, and I'm sure she'll tell you as well. But our view has always been like you try to do a very minimal prototype. You don't try to build everything, and you use these online tools such as Figma or or in this case is Marvel, to create a prototype and then test it, and then you can maybe even use a paper prototype. And then by doing that, you can ask people to do a think aloud, or you can ask in the interview, how they did this, what did they think about this part? What workflow were they going through when they did this or that? So anyway, so it's intimately tied to the prototyping process, but I'll leave the future professors to talk about it. Okay, so anyway, so this is me. It's not updated, but if you have any questions, you can also feel free to just like reach out to me as well. I'm available on WeChat as well. So, but then also some of the professors here can answer your questions as well. And I just want to, like, as a final thing, just make sure like you guys understand that the ability to do these kind of interviews and surveys and coding type of skills is very, very valuable. It will be valuable to you beyond this program. It will be valuable to you when you're doing a job interview. It will be valuable to you when you're presenting your work at a high-level conference. So, so I really hope you guys can take time to really practice these skills with each other, but also with strangers when you finally decide to, figure out what to do for your project and to use this as part of your project. Okay, thank you.